People talk about millennials and money like they're a completely different species. They rent longer. They buy homes later. They carry student debt. They change jobs more often. And somehow, somewhere along the way, the explanation became pretty simple. Millennials just want different things. At first, I believed that too. But then I found something strange. Federal Reserve researchers looked at how millennials actually spend, and after accounting for things like age, income, and demographics, their underlying consumption preferences didn't look dramatically different from earlier generations. That confused me, because if millennials don't actually want completely different things, why does their financial behavior look so different? So I stopped looking at opinions, and I started looking at balance sheets. At age 30, the average millennial household held about $190,267 in assets. That sounds pretty good, until I looked at the other side. They also carried about $90,104 in debt. For baby boomers at the same age, average debt was closer to $46,230, almost half. So maybe the millennial story wasn't simply about spending. Maybe it started with something much bigger. What if millennials didn't change first? What if the economics around them did? Before I could answer that, I had to fix one obvious problem. You can't compare a 40-year-old millennial today with a 70-year-old baby boomer today and call that a fair financial comparison. The boomer has had decades longer to earn, save, buy assets, and pay down debt. So I decided to compare generations at roughly the same age. And once I did that, the story got much more interesting. Because I expected millennials to look obviously poorer. Instead, I found something much stranger. They often had more assets than I expected. They just had a very different balance sheet attached to them. And the first place that showed up was debt. I started with baby boomers at age 30. Average assets were about $135,273. Average debt was about $46,230. Subtract one from the other, and average net worth comes to about $89,043. But the median was much lower, about $21,481. That difference matters. An average can be pulled upward by a smaller number of very wealthy households. The median gets closer to the households sitting in the middle. Then I looked at Gen X. At age 30, average assets were about $201,344. Debt was about $86,606. That leaves average net worth around $114,737. Median net worth was about $27,152. Then came millennials. Average assets, $190,267. Debt, $90,104. Average net worth, about $100,163. Median net worth, just $22,122. That wasn't what I expected. Millennials did not have fewer assets than boomers at age 30. They had about $54,994 more. But they also had around $43,874 more debt. So the difference wasn't simply boomers had money. Millennials didn't. It was more like this. Millennials entered adulthood with a bigger financial machine, but with a much larger liability attached to it. And once I saw that, the obvious question became, what exactly was all that extra debt paying for? This is where one number changed the investigation for me. At age 30, average educational debt for baby boomers was about $630. For Gen X, $7,355. For millennials, $14,510. I stared at that progression for a while. $630, $7,355, $14,510. Another comparison in the research showed the same direction. Roughly $14,700 in educational debt for millennials versus around $4,200 for Gen X at a comparable age. Now, debt itself isn't automatically bad. A mortgage is debt. A business loan is debt. Student debt can finance education that raises someone's future earnings. But different debts do different things to a household balance sheet, and that difference becomes much more important once housing enters the picture. Take a mortgage. You borrow money. But on the other side of that, debt sits a house. And over time, if that house appreciates and the mortgage gets paid down, equity can build. Student debt works differently. The education may increase your earning power, but the loan itself doesn't sit on your household balance sheet beside an asset that can later be sold. That made me realize I had been treating all debt like the same thing. It isn't. And housing makes that difference even more important. By the second quarter of 2026, the median sale price of a new home in the United States was about $410,700. Again, I'm not using that number to pretend a millennial buying today faces the exact same market someone faced decades ago. I'm using it because it shows what access to the housing asset can require now. And even before someone buys, shelter is already taking a large bite out of monthly cash flow. In 2024, median gross rent was about $1,487 a month. Median monthly housing costs for homeowners with a mortgage were about $2,035, and renters were spending a median of about 31% of household income on rent. So housing is doing two things at once. It's consuming monthly cash and potentially deciding whether part of that cash flow eventually connects you to an appreciating asset, which made the next question unavoidable. If millennials entered housing later, how much did owning the asset actually matter? For households born in the 1980s, homeownership was about 53.5% in 2019. By 2022, it was about 60.5%, a 7 percentage point increase in just a few years. But the more important number was what happened to wealth. For middle wealth households born in the 1980s, real assets increased by about 57.3% between 2019 and 2022, and housing alone contributed roughly 41 percentage points of that increase. That stopped me, because suddenly this wasn't a story about who bought too much coffee or who took too many vacations. This was about whether you owned an asset during a period when that asset increased sharply in value. And that created a much bigger question. If millennials really entered adulthood behind, why did their wealth eventually start catching up so quickly? Imagine two millennials, similar age, similar income, similar goals. One manages to buy a home before that period of housing appreciation. The other remains a renter. Both still pay for shelter. Both may behave responsibly. But only one participates directly in the increase in housing equity. I couldn't assign them an exact dollar difference from the research I had, but the direction was clear. One person's housing cost is connected to an appreciating asset. The other's isn't. So I added something new to the notebook: income, then access to assets, then timing, then appreciation, then wealth. And suddenly, the millennial financial story looked much less like a debate about personality. It looked like a question of who managed to get onto the asset ladder, and when. But then I found something that broke the story again. In 2016, older millennials had median wealth roughly 38% below what an age-based model would have expected. That fit the story perfectly. Millennials were behind. Then I checked 2019. The gap had narrowed to around 9% below expectations. Still behind, but much closer. Then came 2022. Older millennials were about 37% above their age-based wealth expectation. I checked it again, because that is a huge change. At an average age around 38, the model expected median wealth of roughly $95,000. Actual typical wealth was more than $130,000, more than $35,000 above that modeled expectation. That forced me to throw out another assumption. Millennials did not simply fall behind and stay there. A lot of them recovered. And asset ownership, especially housing, played a large role in that recovery. This was the point where I realized I had been asking the question backwards. I kept asking, why did millennials reject the traditional financial path? But maybe they didn't reject the destination. Maybe the route changed. Think about retirement. In 2025, about 70% of private industry workers had access to a defined contribution retirement plan. Only about 14% had access to a defined benefit pension. Those sound like technical labels. But the difference is simple. A traditional pension puts much more of the retirement promise on the employer. A defined contribution plan puts more responsibility on the worker. You contribute. You decide whether to participate. The money gets invested. And your final result depends on what was contributed and what happened to those investments. Same goal. Retirement. Different route. And once I saw that pattern in housing, education debt, and retirement, I crossed out the line I'd written at the beginning. Millennials rejected the old financial path and replaced it with, the financial path changed first. But there was still one stereotype left to test. If millennials supposedly cared less about traditional financial security, were they actually saving less for it? At age 30, average retirement account assets for baby boomers were about $4,562. For Gen X, $9,598. For millennials, $11,864. That surprised me. The generation constantly accused of ignoring the future actually had the highest average retirement account assets of the three groups at age 30. That doesn't prove every millennial is a great saver. Of course not. But it makes the blanket claim that millennials simply don't care about long-term financial security very difficult to defend. Then I checked household spending. In 2023, average millennial household expenditure was about $81,589. For Gen X, it was about $95,692. Now, that comparison needs caution. The generations are at different life stages, different family sizes, different ages, so I'm not going to pretend it proves millennials are more frugal. But it does show why raw spending totals don't support the cartoon version of millennials simply spending everything they earn. By now, the model in my notebook looked completely different from the one I started with, and the numbers were pointing toward a much broader explanation. At first, I had different values, then different spending, then different outcomes. Now I had economic environment, debt structure, housing access, asset ownership, retirement responsibility, available choices, financial behavior, and finally, wealth. That doesn't mean culture doesn't matter. Of course, generations develop different habits. Technology changes, work changes, social expectations change. But the financial evidence kept pointing towards something more basic. People respond to the environment around them. If education requires more debt, that changes the starting balance sheet. If housing becomes harder to access, that changes when wealth building through property begins. If retirement responsibility moves toward the individual, saving and investing become more personal decisions. And if missing an asset, boom can separate two otherwise similar households. Timing starts to matter almost as much as income. So after all of this, I don't think the useful question is, are millennials better with money or worse? The evidence doesn't give me a clean answer to either one. The better conclusion is this. Millennials seem financially different because they experienced a different route toward many of the same goals: security, housing, retirement, independence, wealth. The destination didn't disappear. The road changed. So I wrote down the numbers that changed my mind. Underlying consumption preferences, not dramatically different after controls. Median net worth at age 30. Millennials, $22,122. Boomers, $21,481. Educational debt at age 30. Millennials, $14,510. Boomers, $630. Retirement account assets at age 30. Millennials, $11,864. Boomers, $4,562. And the biggest reversal, older millennial wealth went from about 38% below expectations in 2016 to about 37% above expectations in 2022. The biggest financial lever I found wasn't some special spending trick. It was access to assets, especially housing. So my verdict isn't that millennials figured money out, and it isn't that they failed. It's that many of them were trying to reach familiar financial goals through a different economic environment. Same basic goals, different financial route. When I started this, I thought the explanation would mostly be cultural. Different generation, different priorities, different relationship with money. And some of that may still be true. But the numbers changed the way I see it. Millennials had more educational debt, a different balance sheet structure, different access to housing, more personal responsibility for retirement, and wildly different wealth outcomes depending on whether they managed to acquire appreciating assets. Then many of them eventually caught up. That part mattered to me, because it means the story isn't simply about a generation that failed to follow the old rules. It may be about a generation discovering that the old rules no longer produced exactly the same journey. I thought millennials changed what they wanted from money. Now I think the way they tried to reach it changed first. Economic environment, available choices, financial behavior, outcome. And if millennials adapted to the economy they entered, the generation after them is doing the same thing right now. What is money doing to Gen Z?